In the early years of the 20th century, the southernmost continent on Earth was the ultimate deadly prize. The heroic age of Antarctic exploration was dominated by legendary names like Roald Amundsen, Robert Falcon Scott, and Ernest Shackleton, men who were locked in a desperate, highly publicized race to be the first to plant their nation's flag at the South Pole. But an Australian geologist named Douglas Mawson had a completely different vision. When Captain Scott invited Mawson to join his famed push for the pole, Mawson politely declined. He wasn't interested in the glory of simply standing at the bottom of the Earth. He wanted to conduct rigorous, unprecedented scientific research and map the thousands of miles of completely uncharted Antarctic coastline directly south of Australia. In 1911, Mawson organized and led the Australasian Antarctic expedition. His ship, the Aurora, pushed through the grinding pack ice and dropped Mawson and his men at a desolate stretch of coastline known as Commonwealth Bay. They established their main base at Cape Denison, building a sturdy wooden hut to survive the coming winter. They quickly discovered that they had unknowingly built their home in the most hostile microclimate on the planet. Cape Denison is officially recognized as the windiest place on Earth at sea level. The men were subjected to relentless, screaming katabatic winds that flowed off the massive polar ice cap. The winds averaged 50 miles per hour for the entire year, frequently unleashing hurricane-force gusts that exceeded 200 miles per hour, making the simple act of walking outside to fetch coal a life-threatening ordeal. Despite the horrific weather, the men survived the dark winter, and as the brief Antarctic summer arrived in late 1912, the expedition broke into several teams to explore the unknown continent. Douglas Mawson chose to lead the Far Eastern Party. His goal was to push deep into the uncharted Eastern Territory, map the glaciers, and gather geological data. He selected 2 exceptional men to join him. The first was Belgrave Ninnis, a young, physically imposing lieutenant in the British Army who managed the expedition's sled dogs. The second was Xavier Mertz, a Swiss mountaineer and champion skier who was renowned for his incredible stamina and perpetual good mood. On November 10, 1912, Mawson, Ninnis, and Mertz left the safety of Cape Denison. They took 3 sleds and a team of the strongest Greenland Huskies, carrying enough food, fuel, and equipment to sustain them for a massive, multi-month journey. The landscape they were traveling over was an incredibly treacherous, blinding expanse of white ice. The Antarctic ice sheet is constantly moving, creating massive, deep cracks known as crevasses. The deadly trap of a crevasse is that it is often entirely invisible from the surface, covered by a thin, fragile bridge of wind-blown snow that can easily support the weight of a man on skis, but instantly collapse under the concentrated weight of a loaded sled. For the first 5 weeks, the Far Eastern Party made excellent progress. They pushed over 300 miles away from base camp, navigating around massive glaciers and charting mountains that no human eye had ever seen. By December 14th, they were deep in the wilderness, enjoying relatively good weather. Mertz was leading the way on skis, singing quietly to himself, effortlessly gliding over the snow and testing the ground. Mawson followed behind him, riding on the first dog sled, which carried most of their scientific instruments and a small portion of their supplies. Ninnis brought up the rear, walking beside the heaviest sled, which contained the expedition's main canvas tent, the heavy tools, the dog food, and almost all of the men's human rations. Mawson noticed a faint depression in the snow, a subtle shadow indicating a hidden crevasse. He called out a warning to Ninnis behind him. Mawson crossed the snow bridge safely, the long runners of his sled distributing the weight over the fragile crust. A few moments later, Mawson stopped his sled to calculate their coordinates. He turned around to check on his companion. He expected to see Ninnis walking toward him against the blinding white horizon. But there was nothing. The landscape behind him was completely empty. Mawson felt a sudden terrifying drop in his stomach. He shouted for Mertz, and the two men raced back along their tracks. Exactly where Ninnis had been walking, they found a massive, gaping hole in the snow. The snow bridge had completely collapsed. Mawson and Mertz laid flat on their stomachs, carefully inching up to the edge of the abyss, and peered down into the dark blue ice. The crevasse was over 10 feet wide and dropped straight down into total, impenetrable darkness. About 150 feet below the surface, they could barely make out a small, icy ledge. Resting on that ledge were 2 dead dogs and a single canvas food bag. There was no sign of the heavy sled, and there was absolutely no sign of Ninnis. Mawson and Mertz tied all of their remaining ropes together, but it was nowhere near long enough to reach the ledge, let alone the bottomless depths below it. For 3 agonizing hours, the two men lay on the ice, staring into the dark void, calling Ninnis's name over and over again. The only response was the cold wind howling over the frozen ocean. Belgrave Ninnis was gone. As the shock began to subside, a new, entirely different terror took hold. Mawson and Mertz stood up and took an inventory of what they had left. Because Ninnis had fallen with the primary supply sled, their situation was mathematically impossible. They were exactly 311 miles from base camp. They had no tent, leaving them completely exposed to the sub-zero temperatures. They had no food for the 6 remaining dogs, and they had exactly 1.5 weeks of human rations to survive a journey that would take over a month. They were standing on a featureless plateau of ice, staring at a guaranteed death sentence. But Douglas Mawson was not a man who surrendered to mathematics. He looked at Mertz and told him they were walking back. To survive the freezing nights without a tent, they used a spare canvas cover to drape over a makeshift frame of skis, creating a tiny, cramped shelter that barely blocked the wind. But the most pressing issue was the complete lack of food. To survive, they had to resort to the ultimate grim reality of polar exploration. They had to systematically slaughter their remaining dogs. They killed the weakest dog first, feeding the tough, stringy muscle meat to themselves and to the other starving dogs. As the days ground on and the miles ticked by, they killed the dogs one by one. But a dog provides very little nutritional energy for a human burning thousands of calories dragging a sled through deep snow. Nothing could be wasted. They boiled the bones, ate the paws, and consumed the internal organs, including the brains and the liver. What neither Mawson, Mertz, nor anyone in the medical community at the time knew was that the liver of an Arctic husky is incredibly toxic to humans. It contains lethally high concentrations of vitamin A. By desperately trying to absorb every possible calorie, the two men were unknowingly poisoning themselves. The condition is known as hypervitaminosis A, and its physical effects are horrific. By the end of December, the toxicity began to destroy Xavier Mertz. He was a champion athlete, but his body rapidly deteriorated. He suffered from severe, crippling abdominal pain. The skin on his body began to peel away in massive sheets. His hair fell out in clumps. Mertz, who had been a vegetarian before the expedition, found the tough, half-cooked dog meat completely repulsive, and the severe vitamin A poisoning triggered a rapid cognitive decline. He became delirious, refusing to walk and demanding to stay in his sleeping bag. Mawson was also suffering the exact same symptoms of the poisoning, but he somehow managed to maintain his mental clarity. He desperately tried to save his friend, dragging Mertz on the sled when the Swiss skier refused to walk. But Mertz's mind was entirely broken. In early January, Mertz suffered a series of violent seizures. In a fit of sheer, terrifying delirium, he bit off his own frost-bitten finger. Hours later, he fell into a deep coma. On the morning of January 8, 1913, Xavier Mertz died in his sleeping bag. Douglas Mawson was now completely alone. He was roughly 100 miles from Cape Denison. His body was rotting from the inside out, he was starving to death, and the wind was relentlessly tearing at his fragile canvas shelter. He buried Mertz under a pile of snow, marked the grave with 2 crossed skis, and sat down to face his reality. He knew the odds of a single man surviving a 100-mile trek across heavily crevassed ice in his physical condition were practically zero, but he resolved that if he was going to die, he would die walking forward. To lighten his load, Mawson used a small saw to cut his wooden sled entirely in half, creating a much smaller, lighter sledge to drag. As he prepared to resume the march, he sat in his shelter to change his socks. When he pulled his wool socks off, the pain was agonizing. He looked down in absolute horror. The severe vitamin A poisoning and profound frostbite had caused the entire thick soles of both of his feet to completely separate from the underlying tissue. The thick pads of skin came off in one solid piece. The raw, bleeding flesh exposed underneath was so incredibly sensitive that he could barely stand, let alone drag a heavy sled across jagged ice. Mawson took the detached soles of his feet, slathered them with a thick layer of lanolin ointment, and literally pressed the dead skin back onto his raw feet. He pulled on 6 pairs of socks to hold the decaying flesh in place, shoved his feet into his frozen boots, and stood up. He strapped himself into his sled harness and began to walk. For the next week, Mawson entered a state of sheer robotic endurance. He was a skeleton wrapped in wind-proof canvas, leaning into the freezing wind, dragging his half-sled over the blinding ice. Every single step was an agony that defied description. But the ice had one more terrifying trial waiting for him. On January 17th, Mawson was navigating a particularly dangerous, heavily cracked glacier. He was carefully probing the snow ahead of him, entirely focused on placing his ruined feet. Suddenly, without a single sound or warning, the snow bridge beneath him completely vanished. Mawson fell straight down into the dark blue void. He plummeted 14 feet before the sled harness rope violently jerked tight, slamming the breath out of his lungs and arresting his fall. He was dangling in the freezing darkness of a massive crevasse. He looked up and saw his sled deeply wedged in the heavy snow at the very edge of the hole. If the sled shifted even an inch, it would pull loose and drop, sending both the sled and Mawson plummeting hundreds of feet to the bottom of the glacier. He was spinning slowly on the thin rope, completely exhausted, starving, and in agonizing pain. Dangling in the void, Mawson later wrote that he felt a profound, overwhelming sense of relief. The sheer terror of the fall was replaced by the realization that his long, agonizing struggle was finally over. All he had to do was reach down, unbuckle his heavy canvas harness, and slip into the dark. It would be entirely painless. The freezing drop would end the starvation, the rotting feet, and the endless howling wind. The temptation to let go was the strongest force he had ever felt. But as he hung there in the dark, his mind rebelled against the surrender. He decided that he would not give the continent the satisfaction of an easy kill. Summoning the absolute last reserves of adrenaline in his decaying muscles, Mawson reached up and grabbed the thin rope above his head. He pulled his entire body weight upward. Hand over hand, inch by inch, he climbed the freezing rope toward the light. His raw, bleeding hands slipped on the icy fibers, but he forced himself higher. He finally reached the lip of the crevasse, throwing his arms over the solid edge of the snow. But as he pulled his chest over the edge, the fragile snow crust completely shattered under his weight. Mawson fell backwards, plummeting back down into the dark, snapping the rope tight and violently knocking himself unconscious. When he regained consciousness, he was still dangling in the harness. The sled had held. He was freezing to death, entirely spent, but the sheer, stubborn will to live took over again. For a second time, he grabbed the rope. He climbed the 14 feet, his muscles screaming, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He reached the edge, and this time, he did not pull himself up onto his knees. He stayed perfectly flat, distributing his weight, and slowly pushed himself through the broken snow until he was lying safely on the solid ice. He lay there for an hour, entirely unable to move, listening to the wind. Mawson continued to walk. On January 29th, a profound stroke of luck finally broke his nightmare. He stumbled upon a small cairn of snow built by a search party from the base camp. Inside was a bag of food and a note. The note told him that a supply depot known as Aladdin's Cave was located just a few miles ahead, only 5 miles from the main base at Cape Denison. Mawson dragged himself to Aladdin's Cave, a small shelter carved into the ice, and found abundant supplies. He was incredibly close to safety, but the Antarctic weather intervened one final time. A massive, screaming blizzard pinned him inside the small ice cave for an entire week. He was so close to home he could practically walk it in an hour, but stepping outside in the whiteout conditions meant certain death. He sat in the cave, eating the proper rations, allowing his ruined body to slightly recover, and waited. Finally, on February 8, 1913, the wind suddenly died down. The sun broke through the clouds. Mawson stepped out of the ice cave and looked down the long slope toward the ocean. In the distance, he could clearly see the dark wooden structure of the winter hut at Cape Denison. But as he looked further out into Commonwealth Bay, his heart completely sank. There, a mere speck on the horizon, was the ship, the Aurora. It was sailing away. The captain of the Aurora had waited as long as he physically could, but the brutal Antarctic winter was rapidly closing in. If the ship stayed any longer, it would be permanently crushed by the freezing sea ice. Believing that the Far Eastern party had perished, the captain made the agonizing decision to sail back to Australia to save the rest of the crew. Mawson began to walk down the icy slope toward the empty hut, fully believing he had survived hell only to face another entire year of absolute isolation and likely starvation. But as he neared the camp, he saw a figure emerge from the wooden hut. 6 men had volunteered to stay behind in the windiest place on Earth. They had built a small shore party to spend one more winter in the freezing darkness, hoping against hope that someone from the Far Eastern party might return. The men looked up and saw a solitary, skeletal figure dragging a half-sled toward them. He was completely unrecognizable. His face was blackened by frostbite. His skin was hanging in strips, and his eyes were hollow. The men ran up the ice to meet him. When they reached him, one of the men stared at the horrific, emaciated ghost and asked, "My God, which one are you?" Douglas Mawson had survived. He had trekked over 100 miles completely alone, navigating lethal crevasses and battling hypervitaminosis, frostbite, and starvation. When he told the men about the fate of Ninnis and Mertz, the devastating reality of the expedition settled over the small group. They immediately tried to recall the Aurora using a makeshift wireless radio, but the heavy ice prevented the ship from turning back. Mawson and the 6 men had to wait an entire year in the howling darkness of Cape Denison before the ship finally returned the following summer to bring them home. When Douglas Mawson finally returned to Australia, he was hailed as a national hero. He was knighted by the King of England, and his incredible story captivated the world. But unlike the tragic romantic failure of Captain Scott or the rapid flag-planting success of Amundsen, Mawson's expedition brought back an unparalleled wealth of scientific data. They mapped vast stretches of unknown coastline, discovered new biological species, and laid the foundation for modern Antarctic geology. The survival of Douglas Mawson remains one of the most astonishing feats of physical and psychological endurance in human history. It is a story of a man who was stripped of absolutely everything: his companions, his food, his shelter, and even the skin on his feet, and still refused to surrender to the darkness. Dangling over a bottomless void in the most hostile environment on the planet, he chose to climb, leaving behind a legacy that proves the absolute, unbreakable limit of the human will to live.